March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. Hauptmann Klaus Faber adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the sky through the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. Below him, the morning sun painted long shadows across the Reich's capital. Behind him, 41 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 26 waited in tactical formation, engines throttled back to conserve fuel while they orbited 15 miles northeast of Berlin. The radio crackled with reports from forward observers. American bombers inbound. Over 700 heavy bombers, fortresses and liberators grinding toward Berlin at 22,000 feet in their characteristic combat boxes. The formations stretched for miles, their contrails writing straight white lines across the winter sky. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Faber had flown combat missions since 1941. He'd fought over the Channel during the Battle of Britain, survived the meat grinder above Stalingrad, and returned to defend the Reich against the growing American daylight offensive. In 3 years of war, he'd learned to read the patterns of aerial combat with an intimacy that kept him alive when so many others died. He knew the bomber formations would be escorted by American fighters, probably Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy, powerful aircraft that could match his Messerschmitt above 20,000 feet, but lacked the range to follow bombers all the way to Berlin. The standard American tactic was predictable. Escort fighters would accompany the bombers to the limit of their fuel range somewhere over western Germany, then turn back toward England before their tanks ran dry. This left a gap of perhaps 30 to 40 minutes when the bombers flew unescorted over the heart of the Reich. That gap was where Faber and his Jagdgeschwader earned their kills. The tactical plan was textbook Luftwaffe doctrine for early 1944. Let the American escorts reach their fuel limit and depart. Wait until the bombers were alone. Then attack in mass formation with enough fighters to overwhelm the bombers' defensive fire. The heavily armed and armoured Sturmgruppe, Focke-Wulf, 190 fighters, would bore straight into the bomber formations from head-on, their 30mm cannon capable of destroying a B-17 with a single well-placed burst. Faber's lighter Messerschmitt 109s served as top cover, keeping any remaining escorts away from the attacking Focke-Wulfs. It was a system that worked. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1943, German fighter units had inflicted catastrophic losses on American bomber formations. The October 14th raid on Schweinfurt had cost the Americans 60 bombers in a single afternoon. Black Thursday, the survivors called it. Mission planners in England were running out of crews faster than replacement training could fill the gaps. But something felt different this morning. Faber checked his fuel gauges out of habit 3/4 full, enough for perhaps 90 minutes of combat and the flight back to base, and returned his attention to the approaching bomber stream. The formations were still 50 kilometers away, close enough now that he could make out individual aircraft as dark specks against the hazy sky. Then his wingman's voice cut through the radio. "Indianer, 3 o'clock high. Fighter contacts at 3 o'clock, high altitude." Faber cranked his head right and squinted into the bright eastern sky. At first, he saw nothing but empty air and scattered clouds. Then the sun glinted off something metallic, multiple somethings, and his blood went cold. Fighters, American fighters, but not where they should be. Not turning back toward England after reaching their fuel limit. These fighters were still here, still escorting the bombers, still between the Luftwaffe and their targets, and they were over Berlin. Faber had been briefed on American fighter capabilities dozens of times. He knew the specifications by heart. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of approximately 175 miles with external fuel tanks. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning could reach perhaps 230 miles. Both excellent aircraft, both dangerous opponents in combat. But neither had the range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The distance from England to Berlin was over 500 miles one way. The mathematics were simple and absolute. American fighters could not be here, except they were. Through his canopy, Faber watched as the American formation resolved into distinct aircraft profiles. Not the bulky, round-nosed shape of Thunderbolts. Not the distinctive twin-boom silhouette of Lightnings. These were different. Sleek, streamlined, single-engine fighters, with inline liquid-cooled engines and bubble canopies that offered exceptional visibility. He'd seen intelligence photographs of this type, but had never encountered one in combat. The Americans called them Mustangs, North American P-51B and C models, powered by Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that generated 1,700 horsepower at war emergency power. Luftwaffe intelligence had tracked the P-51's introduction to the European theatre since late 1943. The aircraft had appeared in limited numbers, escorting bombers to targets in Western Germany and France. Combat reports indicated it was fast, capable of 437 miles per hour at 30,000 feet and highly maneuverable above 20,000 feet, where the supercharged Merlin engine thrived. German pilots who'd engaged them reported that the Mustang could outturn a Messerschmitt 109 and outdive a Focke-Wulf 190 at altitude. But the reports also consistently noted the P-51's operational radius, approximately 275 miles with external fuel tanks, enough to reach targets in the Rhineland, enough to provide escort over the Ruhr industrial region, not enough, not remotely enough to reach Berlin. The intelligence was wrong, or incomplete, or based on assumptions that no longer applied. Faber counted the American fighters visible in his sector, at least 30 aircraft, possibly more scattered throughout the bomber formation. They flew in loose combat spreads, maintaining altitude advantage over the bombers they escorted. Their external fuel tanks had already been jettisoned, standard procedure once fighters entered combat airspace, but they showed no signs of fuel concerns, no indication they were about to turn back to stay within range of their bases in England. His radio filled with chatter as other German pilots spotted the American escorts, confusion mixed with alarm. No one had briefed them on the possibility of escort fighters over Berlin. The entire tactical doctrine, wait for the escorts to leave, then attack, had just become irrelevant. Major Günther Rahl, leading the Geschwader, made the decision within seconds. They would attack anyway. The bombers had to be stopped, and the mission could not be aborted simply because American fighters were present. German pilots would engage both bombers and fighters simultaneously, accepting whatever casualties resulted. Orders crackled through the radio. Alle Staffeln angreifen, im Nahkampf. All squadrons, attack. Close combat. The formation tightened, engines pushed to maximum continuous power as they began their diving attack toward the bomber stream. Faber's Messerschmitt accelerated smoothly, the supercharged Daimler-Benz 605 engine responding with the harsh mechanical scream that had become the soundtrack of his war. At 26,000 feet, diving through broken clouds at 350 miles per hour, Faber lined up a B-17 flying in the lead element of a combat box. His gun sight centered on the bomber's nose, right where the cockpit and flight deck created the most vulnerable target. His finger moved to the trigger, preparing to fire the two 13mm machine guns and single 20mm cannon mounted in his aircraft's nose. Then tracers arced past his canopy from above and behind. 50 caliber rounds, the distinctive signature of American fighter armament, streaking through the air where his aircraft had been a fraction of a second earlier. Instinct overrode targeting. Faber yanked the stick hard left and rolled inverted, breaking away from the bomber and the attack run. His Messerschmitt snapped through a barrel roll with the violent acceleration that defined fighter combat, every rivet and weld in the airframe stressed to design limits. The American fighter, a P-51 painted in the standard olive drab and neutral grey camouflage, flashed past in pursuit, close enough that Faber could see the pilot's head turning inside the bubble canopy, tracking him through the maneuver. The Mustang pilot didn't fire again, didn't waste ammunition on a deflection shot that had minimal probability of hitting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Instead, he adjusted his pursuit angle and stayed on Faber's tail with the smooth precision that indicated extensive training and combat experience. Faber reversed his turn, pulling maximum G-force in a climbing spiral that compressed his body into the seat and greyed out the edges of his vision. The Messerschmitt responded it always did, turning inside the American's radius and gaining separation. But the P-51 stayed with him, matching the turn and maintaining pursuit with an ease that Faber found deeply unsettling. The dogfight descended through 15,000 feet, as both aircraft traded altitude for speed and maneuverability. Faber tried every defensive tactic in his repertoire: split S into a dive, chandelle 2, reverse direction, yo-yo maneuver to extend distance and reset the engagement geometry. The American pilot countered each move with textbook precision. Not brilliant, not particularly creative, but fundamentally competent in ways that suggested dozens or hundreds of hours of training before ever reaching combat. At 8,000 feet, Faber's fuel situation became critical. He'd burned through a quarter of his tanks just staying alive for the past 7 minutes. The mathematics were brutal. He had perhaps 40 minutes of fuel remaining at combat power, maybe 60 if he throttled back to cruise settings. Not enough to continue fighting and still reach his airbase. The decision made itself. He broke off the engagement with a snap roll that momentarily masked his aircraft from the Americans' guns, then dove toward the deck in a maximum power escape. The P-51 pursued for perhaps 20 seconds, firing one final burst that went wide, then broke away to return to the bomber. Formation. Standard fighter tactics. Don't chase individual targets away from your primary mission. Stay with the bombers. Protect them until the job is done. Faber leveled out at 2,000 feet and turned southeast toward his base near Frankfurt and Der Oder. His hands shook slightly on the control stick, adrenaline aftermath mixed with exhaustion and the creeping awareness of how close he'd come to dying. Behind him, the sky over Berlin filled with contrails and smoke as hundreds of aircraft engaged in the largest air battle yet fought over the Reich's capital. As he flew home, Faber ran through what he'd witnessed, trying to make sense of intelligence data that no longer matched reality. The Americans had fighters over Berlin, fighters that could escort bombers all the way to the capital and still have enough fuel to fight aggressively once they arrived. Fighters that performed as well or better than the Luftwaffe's best interceptors at the altitudes where combat actually occurred. If this was possible, if American fighters could now reach any target in Germany, then the entire defensive strategy of the Reich was obsolete. There would be no more safe gaps where bombers flew unescorted, no more opportunities to attack from advantage, just endless running battles against escorts that outnumbered and increasingly outclassed the defending Jagdwaffe. The tactical implications were catastrophic, but more troubling was the question Faber couldn't answer. How had the Americans solved the range problem? What technology or modification had extended the P-51's combat radius by 200 miles overnight? The answer was already in production at North American Aviation's facilities in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas. An engineering solution so simple it seemed almost obvious in retrospect, yet so significant it would fundamentally alter the balance of air power over Europe. An 85-gallon fuel tank, self-sealing, rubber-lined, positioned in the fuselage directly behind the pilot's seat. The story of how that tank and the tactical doctrine it enabled destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force begins not in combat, but in a North American Aviation engineering office 18 months earlier. August 1943. The United States Army Air Forces faced a strategic crisis that threatened the entire European bombing campaign. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing depended on heavy bombers penetrating deep into Germany to attack industrial targets with accuracy impossible during night raids. But the losses were unsustainable. Without effective long-range fighter escort, bomber formations were being systematically destroyed by Luftwaffe interceptors at a rate that would exhaust available crews and aircraft before achieving meaningful strategic impact. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and Lockheed P-38 Lightning had provided stopgap fighter protection, but both had severe range limitations. The P-47, despite being an excellent high-altitude fighter, could barely reach targets in western Germany before fuel constraints forced it to turn back. The P-38 theoretically had better range, but mechanical problems with its Allison engines in the frigid conditions of high-altitude European combat had limited its availability and effectiveness. Then came the P-51B Mustang. North American Aviation had originally designed the aircraft for the British Royal Air Force in 1940, powered by an Allison V17-10 engine that delivered excellent performance below 15,000 feet, but suffered at higher altitudes. The RAF used early Mustangs for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles, where low-altitude performance mattered more than high-altitude capability. The breakthrough came when British engineers at Rolls-Royce experimented with installing their Merlin 61 engine in a captured Mustang airframe. The two-stage, two-speed supercharged Merlin transformed the aircraft's high-altitude performance. Top speed jumped from 390 miles per hour to 437. Service ceiling increased from 31,000 feet to 42,000. But most critically, fuel efficiency at cruise settings improved dramatically. North American secured licensing rights to build the Merlin engine domestically through Packard Motor Company and began producing the P-51B model in June 1943. The aircraft that emerged combined the best airframe design of the war with the best engine, creating a fighter that could match or exceed any opponent in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability above 20,000 feet. But it still couldn't reach Berlin. The original P-51B carried fuel in 2 wing tanks, 92 gallons in each wing, for a total of 184 gallons of internal fuel. With careful fuel management at optimal cruise settings, this gave the aircraft a combat radius of approximately 275 miles, enough for targets in France and Western Germany. Not enough for Berlin, which sat more than 500 miles from Allied bases in England. The obvious solution was external drop tanks. These expendable fuel containers could be mounted on wing racks, extending range until combat required their jettison. The P-51B could carry 2 75-gallon drop tanks, adding 150 gallons to the total fuel load. With internal and external fuel combined, the theoretical range increased substantially. But drop tanks created problems of their own. The external tanks produced significant drag, reducing speed and maneuverability. They had to be jettisoned before engaging enemy fighters, which limited how far into enemy territory they could be retained. And even with maximum external fuel, the combat radius still fell short of Berlin by a substantial margin. The Army Air Forces needed more fuel, capacity. Not external capacity that could be dropped, but internal capacity that would remain available throughout the mission. In July 1943, Major General Oliver Eccles, head of the Air Force's Material Command, issued a directive to all fighter manufacturers: maximize internal fuel capacity by any means possible. North American Aviation's engineering team, led by Edgar Schmued, analyzed the P-51B's internal structure, looking for available space. The wings were already maximized with fuel tanks and ammunition storage. The area forward of the cockpit housed the engine, oil system, coolant radiators, and critical flight controls. But directly behind the pilot's seat, there was empty space, unused volume, where radio equipment and oxygen bottles had been positioned with room to spare. Schmued's team calculated that an additional fuel tank could be installed in this space without requiring major airframe modifications. The challenge was center of gravity. Adding 570 pounds of fuel, the weight of 85 gallons 6 feet behind the pilot would shift the aircraft's balance point dangerously far aft. With a full fuselage tank, the P-51 would become unstable, prone to pitching oscillations and difficult to control during takeoff and landing. The solution was tactical rather than technical. Pilots would burn fuel from the fuselage tank first, during the cruise phase before entering combat airspace. By the time they encountered enemy fighters and needed maximum maneuverability, the fuselage tank would be empty or nearly so, restoring normal center of gravity. The external drop tanks would be retained as long as possible to extend range, then jettisoned when combat began. Testing began in August 1943 using a modified P-51B designated as the test aircraft. The results were immediately promising, with 184 gallons in wing tanks, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank, and two 75-gallon drop tanks. Total fuel capacity reached 419 gallons. At optimal cruise power settings around 2,000 rpm at 25,000 feet, the Packard Merlin V1653 engine consumed approximately 60 gallons per hour. Simple mathematics revealed the impact. 419 gallons divided by 60 gallons per hour equals nearly 7 hours of endurance. Account for takeoff, climb to altitude, reserve fuel for combat and landing, and the combat radius extended to approximately 880 miles, more than sufficient to reach Berlin with fuel remaining for 30 minutes of combat at war emergency power. North American received approval to modify the production line immediately. The P-51B-7 and all subsequent models included the 85-gallon fuselage tank as standard equipment. Retrofit kits were manufactured for earlier aircraft already in service, allowing the entire operational fleet to be upgraded in the field. The first P-51B models with the fuselage tank modification reached England in December 1943, assigned initially to the 354th Fighter Group of the 9th Air Force. These aircraft flew their first combat missions on December 1st, escorting bombers to targets along the French coast. The missions were routine, designed to validate the aircraft and allow pilots to gain combat experience before attempting deeper penetrations into Germany. Word spread quickly through 8th Air Force headquarters that a fighter finally existed with the range and performance to escort bombers to any target in the Reich. General Ira Eaker, then commanding 8th Air Force, immediately began requisitioning P-51 units from 9th Air Force for bomber escort duty. By February 1944, the transfer of fighter groups from tactical to strategic roles was well underway. But converting to the P-51 required more than just delivering aircraft. Pilots accustomed to flying P-47s or P-38s needed to learn the quirks of their new mount, particularly the handling characteristics with a full fuselage tank. Flight manuals included specific warnings. Do not attempt combat maneuvers with more than 40 gallons remaining in the fuselage tank. The aft center of gravity made the aircraft dangerously unstable. Pilots who ignored this guidance could find themselves in an unrecoverable flat spin. Lieutenant Robert Goebel of the 31st Fighter Group learned this lesson during a training flight in Italy. With a full fuselage tank and external drop tanks still attached, he attempted a hard climbing turn and nearly lost control as the aircraft pitched violently and stalled. He recovered at less than 5,000 feet, badly shaken but educated. His after-action report emphasized the fuel management protocol: burn the fuselage tank first, then switch to drop tanks, then to wing tanks only after, entering combat and jettisoning externals. The protocol became standard operating procedure across all P-51 units. Pilots would start engines using wing tank fuel, taxi, and take off on the fuselage tank to begin burning its weight, then switch to drop tanks during the climb to operational altitude. The fuselage tank would be nearly empty by the time formations crossed the English Channel, well before any possibility of combat. Drop tanks would carry the formation deep into Germany, providing fuel to fight if bounced by enemy fighters, then be jettisoned as enemy territory grew hostile or when combat became imminent. This fuel management strategy was the key to the P-51's effectiveness. The aircraft carried more internal fuel than most fighters, and the intelligent sequencing of fuel consumption meant pilots always had maximum maneuverability when it mattered most. Meanwhile, 500 miles away, Luftwaffe intelligence analysts struggled to understand what was happening. Reports from frontline units described American fighters penetrating deeper into German airspace than should be theoretically possible. But the reports were fragmentary, inconsistent, and often dismissed as pilot error or exaggeration under combat stress. Major Joseph Pips Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, filed multiple reports in January and February 1944, noting that American fighters, specifically the new North American Mustang type, were appearing over targets in central Germany that should have been beyond their range. His calculations, based on observed flight times and fuel consumption, didn't match the aircraft's supposed specifications. Luftwaffe technical intelligence obtained detailed performance data on the P-51 through multiple sources. They had captured examples of earlier Allison-engined variants. They had interrogated downed American pilots. They had analyzed reconnaissance photographs showing P-51s on English airfields. Every analysis concluded the same thing. The aircraft's combat radius with standard fuel load was approximately 275 miles. Berlin was impossible. What German intelligence failed to discover or failed to credit was the 85-gallon fuselage tank modification. The external appearance of the P-51B didn't change with the fuselage tank installation. No visible difference distinguished aircraft with or without the modification, and American pilots, if captured, had no incentive to discuss fuel capacity details that would aid enemy tactical planning. The result was a massive intelligence blind spot. German commanders planned defensive operations based on the assumption that American fighters could not reach targets beyond the Rhineland in meaningful numbers. This assumption had held true throughout 1943. There was no reason to believe it would change in 1944. Oberst Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter commanders, later wrote in his memoir that the appearance of P-51s over Berlin in March 1944 was a complete shock to everyone involved in fighter defense planning. We had intelligence reports about the aircraft's specifications. We knew its performance envelope. But we did not know or did not believe that the Americans had solved the range problem. When they appeared over the capital, our entire defensive doctrine became obsolete in a single afternoon. The first large-scale test of that new reality came on March 6, 1944. 8th Air Force mission orders called for a maximum effort strike against Berlin, the first major daylight raid on the German capital since the campaign began. 730 bombers were tasked, split between B-17s and B-24s, targeting industrial facilities, rail yards, and government buildings. To protect them, 8th Air Force committed over 800 fighters P-47s from groups that would escort to the German border, P-38s that would continue to the Berlin area, and approximately 175 P-51 Mustangs that would fly all the way to Berlin and back. The P-51s represented only 20% of the escort force numerically, but they would be the only fighters present over the target itself. Among the Mustang units participating was the 357th Fighter Group, which had only been operational for 3 weeks. Major Thomas Hayes led the group's 48 aircraft into German airspace that morning, aware that this would be their first major engagement against the full weight of Luftwaffe resistance. The weather cooperated clear skies over England and Germany, with scattered high clouds that wouldn't interfere with navigation or bombing accuracy. The bomber stream formed up over East Anglia, then turned southeast across the North Sea toward the Dutch coast. Behind them, the fighter groups assembled in layers, staggered by altitude and position to provide maximum coverage. The formation crossed into German airspace at 10:45 hours local time. Immediately, Luftwaffe radar stations tracked the incoming raid and began scrambling interceptor units. This was Berlin, the heart of the Reich. Every available fighter would be thrown into the defense. German pilots launched from bases across northern and central Germany, forming up into Gefechtsverband battle formations designed to overwhelm escorts and attack bombers in mass. But as German fighters climbed to altitude and moved to intercept positions, they encountered something unprecedented. American escort fighters were already there, at operational altitude, between the German interceptors and the bomber stream. Not just at the edge of German territory, not just over Western Germany, but here, 200 miles inside the Reich, deep in what should have been German-controlled airspace. The battle that followed was chaotic, sprawling across hundreds of cubic miles of sky as hundreds of aircraft clashed. P-51s from multiple squadrons engaged Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s in running dogfights that ranged from 30,000 feet down to the deck. The American pilots had numerical superiority locally. The Luftwaffe had expected to attack bombers, not to fight concentrated fighter opposition so far from Allied bases. Major Hayes and his 357th Fighter Group pilots intercepted a major German formation, attempting to attack the bombers from head-on. The standard Luftwaffe tactic for maximizing damage while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. Hayes personally engaged 4 Messerschmitt 109s simultaneously, breaking up their attack and shooting down the formation leader. His wingman got another, the rest scattered, their coordinated assault disrupted before reaching the bombers. Similar engagements played out across the battle space. Every time German fighters moved to attack bombers, they encountered P-51s with the altitude, speed, and endurance to contest them. The escorts weren't defensive, weren't tied close to their bombers. They roamed aggressively, seeking combat, forcing German pilots to fight for position before they could even reach their intended targets. The bombers hit their targets with less interference than any previous deep penetration raid. Losses were severe. 69 bombers failed to return, the highest single-day loss yet suffered by 8th Air Force. But the loss rate was manageable compared to raids like Schweinfurt, where 20% of the force had been destroyed. And critically, the bombers completed their mission, dropping over 1,700 tons of high explosives on Berlin's industrial infrastructure. American fighter losses totaled 11 aircraft, most from the P-38 and P-47 units, rather than the longer-ranged Mustangs. German losses exceeded 80 aircraft destroyed, with another 40 damaged beyond immediate repair. More significantly, German pilot casualties approached 70 killed or seriously wounded, irreplaceable losses from an already strained pilot training pipeline. But numbers don't capture the psychological impact of that mission. German pilots who survived returned to their bases with reports that contradicted everything intelligence had told them. American fighters over Berlin. Not struggling at the edge of their range. Not conserving fuel for the return flight, but fighting aggressively, staying over the target area for extended periods, clearly operating with substantial fuel reserves. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was in Berlin that day. He watched from the ground as contrails filled the sky above the capital, marking the dogfights between his fighters and the American escorts. According to multiple post-war accounts, he recognized immediately what this meant. At Nuremberg after the war, Göring would tell interrogators, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. If the Americans could bring fighters all the way to the capital, they could reach any target in Germany. Our defensive strategy was based on the assumption that bombers would be unescorted for the final approach. That assumption was now invalid." For Hauptmann Klaus Faber, who'd barely survived his engagement over Berlin that morning, the impact was more personal and immediate. He'd spent 3 years of combat, believing that German pilots had qualitative and tactical superiority over their opponents. They flew better aircraft, had superior training, understood aerial combat in ways Allied pilots didn't. Those advantages had compensated for growing numerical inferiority. Now, flying his shot-up Messerschmitt back to base with fuel gauges reading dangerously low, Faber understood that those advantages no longer mattered. The Americans had solved the range problem. They could now be anywhere, at any time, in any strength. The Luftwaffe would be forced to fight every mission outnumbered, at positions chosen by the enemy, with no safe areas where bombers flew unescorted. The engineering that enabled Faber's nightmare afternoon was deceptively simple. Alexander Kartveli at Republic Aviation had built the P-47 around a philosophy of structural over-engineering and redundancy. Edgar Schmued at North American Aviation took a different approach with the P-51. Optimize everything for efficiency, minimize drag, maximize performance per pound of airframe weight. The Mustang's fuselage was a masterwork of aerodynamic design. The laminar flow wing, designed with a specific airfoil shape that maintained smooth airflow over the wing surface longer than conventional designs, reduced drag by approximately 8% compared to traditional wing profiles. This meant less fuel burned to maintain a given airspeed, which translated directly to extended range. The radiator installation was equally ingenious. Most liquid-cooled aircraft treated the coolant radiator as a necessary evil, a source of drag that had to be minimized and hidden. Schmued's team designed the Mustang's radiator installation to actually generate thrust. The intake scoop underneath the fuselage drew in cooling air, passed it through the radiator matrix where it absorbed heat from the engine coolant, then expelled it through a controllable exit flap. The heated air expanded and accelerated through the exit, creating a small but measurable thrust component that partially offset the drag of the installation itself. These efficiency gains meant the Packard Merlin V1653 engine consumed less fuel per mile traveled than comparable engines. At cruise settings of 2,000 RPM and 25 inches of manifold pressure at 25,000 feet, fuel consumption averaged 58 to 62 gallons per hour depending on atmospheric conditions. The P-47 Thunderbolts Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, in comparison, consumed approximately 75 gallons per hour at similar cruise settings. The fuselage fuel tank itself was manufactured by United States Rubber Company using the same self-sealing technology developed for wing tanks. The rubber-impregnated fabric would swell when exposed to fuel, automatically closing bullet holes before significant fuel loss occurred. The tank measured approximately 40 inches long, 20 inches wide, and 14 inches deep, conforming to the internal structure of the fuselage behind the pilot's seat and ahead of the radio equipment bay. Installation required removing an access panel on the fuselage underside, sliding the collapsed tank into position, then connecting fuel lines and vent tubes. A selector valve in the cockpit allowed pilots to switch between wing tanks, fuselage tank, and external drop tanks. The entire retrofit could be completed by ground crews in approximately 4 hours. The center of gravity issue that had initially concerned engineers proved manageable with proper fuel management. The P-51B's longitudinal stability depended on maintaining the center of gravity within a range from 25% to 33% of the mean aerodynamic chord essentially. The balance point had to stay within specific limits relative to the wing's lifting center. With a full fuselage tank, the center of gravity shifted to approximately 35% of mean aerodynamic chord outside the safe envelope. But fuel weighs 6 pounds per gallon. As pilots burned fuel from the fuselage tank during the first hour of flight, they were removing over 500 pounds from behind the cockpit. By the time 45 gallons remained about halfway through the fuselage tank, the center of gravity had shifted forward to approximately 32% of mean aerodynamic chord, well within safe limits. The aircraft handled normally, and combat maneuvers became acceptable. The protocol was strict. Pilots monitored their fuel state constantly during the cruise phase. Takeoff and initial climb used the fuselage tank exclusively. Once at cruise altitude crossing the English Channel, pilots switched to external drop tanks, conserving the fuselage tank fuel until it was needed. If bounced by enemy fighters before reaching the target area, pilots would first jettison drop tanks to reduce drag and improve maneuverability, then continue fighting on fuselage tank fuel until it dropped below 40 gallons, at which point they'd switch to wing tanks. This fuel management dance became second nature to experienced Mustang pilots. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group described it in his mission debriefings as choreographed resource management under stress. You had to know at all times which tank was feeding the engine, how much fuel remained in each tank, how far you were from base, and whether you could afford to extend combat or needed to disengage and head for home. The drop tanks themselves evolved rapidly through late 1943 and early 1944. Initial models were pressed metal, heavy and expensive to manufacture. These were replaced by paper composite tanks, essentially laminated cardboard, impregnated with resin that were lighter, cheaper, and fully expendable. The British called them papier-mâché tanks, though the construction was more sophisticated than the name suggested. Paper drop tanks came in 2 standard sizes, 75 gallons and 110 gallons. The 75-gallon tanks were used for most escort missions, providing a good balance between range extension and minimal drag. The 110-gallon tanks, introduced in mid-1944, extended range even further, but created enough additional drag that they significantly reduced cruise speed. They were typically reserved for ultra-long-range missions or ferry flights. With two 110-gallon drop tanks, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank and 184 gallons in the wings, total fuel capacity reached 489 gallons. At 60 gallons per hour consumption, this provided over 8 hours of endurance. The practical combat radius extended to nearly 1,000 miles, sufficient to escort bombers from England to targets as distant as Czechoslovakia or southern Germany, and return with fuel reserves. Luftwaffe intelligence eventually captured intact examples of P-51s with the fuselage tank modification. Technical evaluation teams at Reich, the Luftwaffe's primary test facility, conducted thorough examinations. Their reports, dated April 1944, confirmed what frontline pilots had been reporting. The Americans had increased internal fuel capacity substantially, extending combat radius to over 800 miles. But the technical reports arrived too late to influence German defensive planning. By April, the pattern had been set. American fighters could reach any target in Germany. The Luftwaffe's doctrine of waiting for escort fighters to depart before attacking bombers was obsolete. German fighters had to engage immediately, fighting through the escorts to reach the bombers, accepting casualties that exceeded replacement rates. The attrition was staggering. In March 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 320 fighters destroyed and approximately 160 pilots killed or seriously wounded in combat over the Reich. German fighter production actually increased during this period. Factories delivered over 1,000 new aircraft in March, but pilot training couldn't keep pace with losses. Oberleutnant Heinz Noack, a veteran pilot with 33 victories, wrote in his diary on March 24, 1944, "We are losing the experienced men faster than new pilots can learn the basics. Yesterday, I flew with a replacement pilot on his third mission. He lasted 40 minutes before a Mustang got him over Hanover. He didn't understand energy tactics, didn't know how to use altitude advantage, panicked when bounced from above. 3 missions, and he's dead. This is happening constantly now." The Luftwaffe attempted several tactical responses to the P-51 threat. One approach was the Gefechtsverband system, massing large formations of heavily armed and armoured Focke-Wulf 198 Sturmbok fighters, escorted by lighter Messerschmitt 109G fighters, whose job was to tie up American escorts while the Sturmgruppe attacked bombers. In theory, this should have worked. The Sturmbok aircraft carried heavy armour plate, thicker canopy glass, and 4 20mm or 30mm cannon. They could absorb substantial battle damage and deliver devastating firepower. If they reached the bomber formations, each Sturmbok could potentially destroy 2 or 3 bombers per mission. In practice, the American fighter tactics disrupted this system. P-51 pilots quickly learned to identify the heavily armed and armoured fighters by their distinctive appearance and flight characteristics. They would ignore the lighter escorts and focus specifically on breaking up the Sturmbok formations before they reached the bombers. The heavily modified Focke-Wulfs were slower and less maneuverable than standard fighters. Once forced into a dogfight, they were vulnerable. Major Walter Dahl, who commanded a Sturmbok unit, described the frustration in his combat reports. "The Americans identify us immediately and attack with numerical superiority before we can close with the bombers. Our escort fighters cannot protect us, they're outnumbered and fighting for their own survival. We lose aircraft and pilots before we can accomplish anything meaningful." Another German response was to concentrate defences around specific high-value targets, creating fighter boxes where multiple squadrons orbited in layers, waiting for bomber formations to enter their sector. This occasionally produced local numerical superiority and significant bomber losses, but it surrendered initiative entirely to the Americans, who could choose to attack the defended target or divert to an alternate with lighter opposition. The broader strategic impact of P-51 operations extended beyond individual missions. American fighter commanders, led by Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle after he took command of 8th Air Force in January 1944, implemented a new tactical doctrine that fundamentally changed fighter employment. Previous doctrine had tied fighters closely to bomber formations in a defensive posture. Fighters stayed within visual range of their assigned bomber boxes, reacting to German attacks but not proactively hunting enemy aircraft. Doolittle reversed this. He directed fighters to range ahead of the bomber stream, sweep wide of the formations, and actively seek combat with German fighters before they could organize attacks on bombers. The range of the P-51 made this aggressive doctrine feasible. Fighters could afford to leave the bombers temporarily because they had fuel to return, fight if necessary, and still complete their mission. P-47s and P-38s couldn't risk such tactics because they operated at the edge of their fuel margins. The results were dramatic. German fighters found themselves under attack while forming up, while climbing to altitude, even while taking off from their own airfields. American pilots began conducting fighter sweeps independent of bomber missions, pure fighter versus fighter operations, designed to attrit German pilot strength regardless of bomber activities. 8th Air Force also authorized low-level strafing attacks on German airfields. P-51 pilots returning in from escort missions would descend to deck level and attack airfields they passed, destroying aircraft on the ground, damaging facilities, killing pilots and ground crew. These attacks were extremely dangerous. German airfields bristled with anti-aircraft guns, but they inflicted disproportionate damage. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group gained fame for strafing Messerschmitt Me-262 jets during takeoff runs at Leipzig Airfield. The revolutionary jets were nearly invincible once airborne, but taking off they were vulnerable. Drew destroyed 2 jets on the runway in a single pass, along with several conventional fighters. The mission demonstrated that even Germany's most advanced aircraft weren't safe from attack. The cumulative effect broke the Luftwaffe's defensive system. Between March and June 1944, German fighter pilot losses exceeded 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The training pipeline couldn't replace them with equivalently skilled pilots. By June 6 D-Day, the Luftwaffe was effectively defeated over Western Europe. Only a few hundred fighters responded to the invasion, and they were quickly overwhelmed by thousands of Allied aircraft. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, sent desperate messages to Berlin, describing the situation. "The enemy has complete air supremacy. Our troops cannot move during daylight without being attacked. Supply columns are destroyed. Without air cover, we cannot hold the invasion beaches." The Luftwaffe's defeat had been achieved primarily by American fighters, particularly P-51s, systematically destroying German fighters and pilots faster than they could be replaced. The 85-gallon fuselage tank that enabled this campaign had cost approximately $300 per unit to manufacture. It added roughly 40 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight. Installation took 4 hours. The strategic impact was decisive. Personal accounts from pilots on both sides illustrate the human dimension of these statistics. Captain Chuck Yeager, flying P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group, described his first mission to Berlin. "We took off from Leiston at 0800, formed up over the channel, and headed southeast. I kept checking my fuel gauges, doing the math. We had over 400 gallons between internals and drop tanks. Berlin was 520 miles away. At normal cruise, we'd get there with fuel to spare and enough reserve to fight for 30 minutes. The flight out was uneventful. We crossed into Germany around 10:30, dropped our external tanks at the German border as planned, and continued on internals. Over Berlin at noon, we engaged a formation of 109s trying to attack the bombers we were escorting. The fight lasted maybe 12 minutes. I got 1 confirmed kill, my wingman got another. Then we turned for home. The flight back was the longest 4 hours of my life. You're constantly checking gauges, calculating remaining fuel against distance to base, knowing that if you miscalculate even slightly, you're swimming in the North Sea or bailing out over occupied territory. We landed at Leiston with maybe 40 gallons remaining, enough for another 30 minutes of flight. The margin was thin, but it was enough. German pilot accounts reflect a different perspective. Lieutenant Gerhard Barkhorn, who survived the war with 301 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, described his experience fighting P-51s during a brief assignment to the Western Front in April 1944. The Mustang was a revelation. It could do everything well. Speed, climb, turn, dive, all excellent. But more than performance, it was the endurance that made it deadly. German fighters were always conscious of fuel state. We had to calculate constantly. Can I afford another 10 minutes of combat? Do I have enough fuel to pursue? The Americans didn't have those constraints. They could fight as long as necessary, then fly home with reserves. This psychological advantage was as significant as any performance edge. The technical evolution of the P-51 continued through 1944. The P-51D model, introduced in mid-1944, featured a bubble canopy that eliminated the razorback fuselage and provided exceptional all-around visibility. The armament increased from 4 50-caliber machine guns to 6, all mounted in the wings. The gun sight upgraded to the K-14 gyroscopic computing sight, which automatically calculated lead angles for deflection shots. But the fundamental secret remained the same. 85 gallons of internal fuel behind the pilot's seat, combined with drop tanks and intelligent fuel management. The D model carried the same internal fuel capacity as the B and C models. The range remained approximately 880 miles combat. Radius. It was enough. Production ramped up dramatically. North American Aviation's Inglewood and Dallas plants combined to deliver over 8,000 P, 51B, C, and D models in 1944 alone. By December, 14 of 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups flew Mustangs. Only the 56th Fighter Group retained P-47 Thunderbolts, and they did so at the explicit request of their commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, who preferred the Thunderbolts' ruggedness and firepower for the low-level attack missions his group specialized in. The strategic bombing campaign that the P-51 enabled achieved mixed results. Precision bombing proved difficult even with fighter escort reducing losses. German industry demonstrated remarkable resilience, dispersing facilities and maintaining production despite sustained attacks. But the destruction of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force was unambiguous. By August 1944, German day fighter strength had fallen to levels that made effective defense impossible. The cost in human lives, both American and German, was staggering. 8th Air Force suffered over 47,000 casualties during the war, more than the entire United States Marine Corps in the Pacific. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 50,000 fighter pilots killed in combat. These were young men, most in their 20s, with skills and training that took years to develop. Their loss represented an irreplaceable hemorrhage of human capital that Germany could not afford. For Hauptmann Klaus Faber, who survived his encounter over Berlin on March 6th and continued flying combat missions through April, the end came on April 24th near Magdeburg. He was leading a flight of 4 Messerschmitt 109s against a formation of B-17s when P-51s bounced them from above. The engagement lasted 3 minutes. Faber managed to shoot down one Mustang before taking hits in his engine and fuselage. He bailed out at 8,000 feet and landed in a farmer's field with a broken ankle. He spent the rest of the war in a military hospital, watching from the ground as contrails wrote the story of Germany's defeat across the sky above. In post-war interviews, he reflected on that March morning when he first encountered Mustangs over Berlin. "I knew immediately that the war was lost, not because of that specific battle, but because of what it represented. If American fighters could reach Berlin, they could reach anywhere. Our entire defensive strategy was obsolete. We fought on for another year, but the outcome was determined that day." The technological and tactical lessons from the P-51's success influenced post-war aviation development. The importance of range and endurance became fundamental to fighter design. The F-86 Sabre that dominated the Korean War incorporated drop tanks and extended internal fuel as standard features. Modern fighters like the 15 Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon use aerial refueling to extend range, but their internal fuel fractions, the percentage of gross weight devoted to fuel, reflect lessons learned from the Mustang's efficiency. The tactical doctrine of aggressive fighter employment, attacking enemy air forces proactively rather than waiting to defend, became standard practice. The Vietnam War's Operation Linebacker campaigns explicitly cited the Mustang precedent: destroy enemy fighters wherever they can be found, including on the ground and during vulnerable phases of flight like takeoff and landing. Perhaps most significantly, the P-51 demonstrated that strategic bombing requires fighter escort to survive against competent opposition. The pre-war doctrine that the bomber will always get through, based on defensive firepower alone, proved catastrophically wrong. Bomber survival required fighters that could accompany them throughout the mission and fight effectively at the target. This lesson was relearned in Vietnam when unescorted bombers suffered unsustainable losses, and again in the 1991 Gulf War when achieving air superiority preceded the bombing campaign. The human dimension of the story extends beyond combat statistics. The P-51 pilots were mostly in their early 20s, trained hastily under wartime conditions, and thrust into combat with survival odds that made completing a full tour of duty statistically unlikely. They fought at altitudes where unheated cockpits meant temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They flew 4 to 6 hour missions in cramped conditions with minimal survival equipment if forced to bail out. Technical Sergeant John Morris, who maintained P-51s for the 357th Fighter Group at Leiston Airfield in England, described the human cost in a letter home in May 1944. "We work 12-hour days keeping the birds flying. Every morning, pilots we know boys really, most barely, old enough to drink climb into cockpits and head for Germany. Sometimes they don't come back. Their aircraft gets reassigned to another pilot, usually within days. We paint over the old pilot's name and put up the new one. The aircraft don't remember who flew them, but we do. We remember every pilot who didn't come home." The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots faced worse. By mid-1944, pilot training time had fallen to under 120 hours total, with some replacement pilots arriving at operational units with less than 50 hours in their assigned aircraft type. Combat veterans described watching new pilots die on their first or second missions, lacking the experience to survive against skilled opponents flying superior aircraft. Hauptmann Hermann Graf, a highly decorated ace with over 200 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, was temporarily assigned to train new pilots in Germany during spring 1944. His frustration appears in letters to his wife. "They send me boys who can barely fly straight and level. They don't understand energy management, don't know tactical formations, freeze when attacked. I try to teach them survival skills, but there's no time. The front needs pilots immediately, so I send them forward knowing most will die within a week. It's murder, but it's war." The strategic bombing campaign that the P-51 enabled had consequences beyond military targets. German civilians experienced sustained aerial attack throughout 1944 and into 1945. While P-51s focused on fighter combat and target area escort, the bombers they protected delivered high explosives and incendiaries on cities across Germany. The moral and ethical complexities of strategic bombing remain debated, but the role of fighter escort in making the campaign possible is unambiguous. For the Allied leadership, the P-51 represented the solution to a strategic problem that had threatened to derail the entire European war effort. Without effective long-range fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign would have collapsed under unsustainable losses by winter 1943. The invasion of Europe, planned for June 1944, depended on achieving air supremacy beforehand. The P-51 provided the tool that made air supremacy possible. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The P-51 Mustang was the most aerodynamically perfect fighter developed during World War II. Its combination of range, speed, and maneuverability made it the decisive weapon in the air war over Europe. Without the Mustang, we could not have achieved air superiority before D-Day. Without air superiority, the invasion would have been far more costly, possibly impossible." The cost-effectiveness of the 85-gallon fuselage tank modification was extraordinary. For less than $400 in material and labor per aircraft, the combat radius increased by over 300 miles. This extended American airpower reach across all of Germany neutralized the Luftwaffe's advantage of operating from interior defensive positions and enabled the destruction of German fighter forces before the Normandy invasion. By August 1944, when Allied ground forces broke out from Normandy and began the advance toward Germany, Luftwaffe fighter strength over Western Europe had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Individual aircraft and small units continued to operate, sometimes with local success, but coordinated defense of German airspace was no longer possible. The few hundred operational fighters available could not contest the thousands of Allied aircraft operating freely across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The P-51 continued to evolve. The P-51H model, introduced in late 1944, featured a more powerful V16-59 engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, a lighter airframe, and a top speed approaching 490 miles per hour. Only a few hundred were built before the war ended, but they represented the ultimate development of the basic design. Post-war, Mustangs remained in service with the United States Air Force through the Korean War, where they flew ground attack missions until superseded by jets. Foreign air forces operated P-51s through the 1970s in some cases. The Israeli Air Force used Mustangs in the 1956 Suez Crisis. The Dominican Republic Air Force flew them operationally until 1984. The basic soundness of the design ensured decades of service, but the historical significance remains tied to that period from December 1943 through June 1944, when P-51s with 85-gallon fuselage tanks extended American fuselage fighter range deep into Germany and destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. Those 6 months determined the outcome of the air war over Europe and enabled the successful invasion that began the liberation of the continent. The strategic paradox is striking. An 85-gallon fuel tank, weighing empty less than 40 pounds, costing $300, had strategic impact that exceeded most individual weapons systems. Not through firepower or armor or technological sophistication, but through the simple expedient of allowing existing aircraft to fly farther and fight longer. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, analyzing captured P-51s after the war, concluded that they had underestimated American engineering pragmatism. German aircraft design emphasized performance optimization, sometimes at the cost of range or endurance. The American approach balanced performance with operational radius, accepting slightly less extreme performance in exchange for greatly extended reach. This philosophical difference reflected broader strategic circumstances. Germany fought a defensive war over interior lines, operating from bases close to the combat zone. Range mattered less than performance. America fought an offensive war from distant bases, needing to project power across hundreds of miles. Range mattered as much as performance. The P-51's design priorities matched American strategic requirements perfectly. The human stories, pilots like Klaus Faber who survived, like those unnamed replacement pilots who died on their first missions, the ground crew who maintained aircraft through English winters, the bomber crews who benefited from fighter protection, they often never saw these stories, illustrate the individual cost of strategic decisions made at levels far above their awareness. For the P-51 pilots, the experience was intensely personal, yet fundamentally impersonal. They flew the same basic missions repeatedly: escort bombers to target, fight any enemy fighters encountered, strafe targets of opportunity on the return. Flight, land back at base, repeat. Each mission was different in specific details, but identical in basic structure. The routine bred both competence and a kind of emotional detachment necessary for psychological survival. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who finished the war credited with approximately 20 aerial victories before being rotated back to the United States for war bond tours, described the emotional toll. You lose friends constantly. The pilot in the next bunk doesn't come back from a mission. His personal effects get packed up and shipped home. A new pilot moves into the bunk. You don't let yourself get too close to anyone because the odds are they won't survive their tour. It's not cynicism, it's self-preservation. But it damages you in ways you don't realize until much later. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. By that point, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist. A few hundred fighters remained operational, but they lacked fuel, experienced pilots, and any reasonable hope of affecting the outcome. The last major Luftwaffe fighter operation was defending Berlin against Soviet forces in April 1945, a hopeless effort that resulted in the destruction of most remaining aircraft and pilots. The P-51 had fulfilled its strategic purpose, enabling the destruction of German fighter forces before the Normandy invasion. The broader bombing campaign's effectiveness remains debated. German war production actually peaked in mid-1944, despite sustained attacks. But the air superiority campaign was unambiguously successful. By June 6, D-Day, Allied aircraft operated over the invasion beaches with minimal opposition. The approximately 300 sorties flown by Luftwaffe fighters on D-Day were overwhelmed by over 14,000 Allied sorties. The lesson was clear and would be relearned in subsequent conflicts. Air superiority must be won before ground operations commence. And winning air superiority requires destroying enemy fighters wherever they can be found in the air, on the ground, during training, by attriting pilots faster than they can be replaced. The P-51, with its 85-gallon fuselage tank enabling 880-mile combat radius, was the tool that made this possible in World War II Europe. The design was right, the timing was right, and the operational doctrine evolved to maximize the aircraft's capabilities. Together, these factors produced strategic results far exceeding what the aircraft specifications alone would suggest. For Hauptmann Klaus Faber, recuperating in a hospital bed while his country collapsed around him, the knowledge that came too late offered no comfort. The Luftwaffe had possessed excellent aircraft, skilled pilots, and sound tactical doctrine, but they had not solved the range problem. They operated from interior positions with short defensive radii, which had seemed like advantage. Shorter distances to intercept meant less fuel required, more time on station, more flights per day. But the Americans had turned geography against them. By extending fighter range to match bomber range, they eliminated the defensive advantage of interior positions. Every target in Germany became vulnerable. Every airfield could be attacked. Every training flight could be interrupted. The Luftwaffe found itself fighting a defensive battle with no safe areas, no opportunity to rest and rebuild, no chance to train pilots properly. The war ended. The survivors went home. The dead were buried or remained where they fell. Aircraft were scrapped or sold as surplus. Airfields returned to farmland. The strategic bombing campaign's physical destruction was repaired within a decade, but the human cost, the tens of thousands of young men who died in aircraft over Europe, that cost remains permanent. The P-51's role in that cost was paradoxical. It enabled the strategic bombing campaign that killed tens of thousands of German civilians and destroyed German cities. It also protected American bomber crews, reducing their casualties and making missions possible that otherwise would have been suicidal. It destroyed the Luftwaffe, killing thousands of German pilots. But by achieving air superiority before D-Day, it enabled the invasion that ultimately ended the war in Europe, potentially saving lives Allied and German by shortening the conflict. These moral complexities defy simple judgment. War forces' choices between terrible alternatives. The decision to pursue strategic bombing rather than negotiate peace involved calculations of military necessity, political will, and strategic vision that operated at levels far above individual pilots and crews. The P-51 was a tool, employed by people making decisions within constraints they did not choose. What remains historically clear is the technical and tactical impact. The addition of 85 gallons of internal fuel capacity, combined with external drop tanks and intelligent operational doctrine, extended American fighter range to match bomber range. This enabled aggressive fighter employment that destroyed the Luftwaffe before the Normandy invasion. The invasion succeeded in part because Allied forces operated under air supremacy achieved through that fighter campaign. The P-51 demonstrated that strategic bombing requires fighter escort, that escort fighters must have range matching the bombers they protect, and that achieving air superiority requires destroying enemy air forces proactively rather than defending passively. These lessons shaped post-war air doctrine and remain relevant in contemporary air warfare. For those who flew the missions, maintained the aircraft, planned the operations, and lived through the period, the experience was immediate and personal. For historians examining the period decades later, the patterns become clear. Technological capability combined with operational doctrine and strategic vision produced decisive results. The 85-gallon fuel tank was not in itself decisive, but it enabled tactics and operations that proved strategically decisive. The story ultimately transcends the technical details. It's about how small engineering decisions can have enormous strategic consequences, how operational range can be as important as firepower or performance, how achieving air superiority requires the right tools employed with the right doctrine at the right time, and how the courage of pilots flying missions day after day, knowing the statistical probability of death or capture, creates the raw material that strategic vision transforms into operational reality. On March 6, 1944, when Klaus Faber first saw P-51 Mustangs over Berlin, he understood immediately that everything had changed. The Americans had solved the range problem. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy was obsolete. The war in the air was lost, even if it took another 14 months for the full implications to play out. That understanding, purchased with the lives of thousands of pilots on both sides, validated by the successful invasion and eventual Allied victory, remains the enduring legacy of the P-51 Mustang and its 85-gallon fuselage tank. Not the most dramatic technological innovation of World War II, not the most powerful weapon system, but perhaps the most strategically significant single modification made to any aircraft during the conflict. The Luftwaffe pilots truly never expected American fighters over Berlin. They couldn't imagine how it was possible. When they discovered the solution, additional internal fuel, better engine efficiency, smarter operational planning, the knowledge came too late to counter it. By the time they understood what had happened, the strategic situation had shifted irrevocably in favor of the Allies. That's how wars are won, not always through dramatic breakthroughs or brilliant strokes, but sometimes through incremental improvements in capability that accumulate into decisive advantages. The P-51, with its 85-gallon fuselage tank, was exactly that kind of advantage. Simple, effective, and ultimately decisive. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.